Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here for our fourth scientific meeting. I'm Dana Luda. I'm the president of the Veolia Institute. It's a wonderful collaboration with the Department of Scientific and Technological Expertise. We invented this formula 2 years ago because they're very important topics for our group and for many of us, but that everybody doesn't necessarily understand. So we wanted to help people understand science better and very cutting-edge topics in a lively and simple manner. It's open to everyone, and it's this idea of better understanding stakes around energy and the ecological transition. And this is why, given the importance of Veolia and their actions on human and environmental health, as well as in sustainable development, hydrogen is very apt for this topic. So last time, it was more linked to the facts on climate change, health, environmental health. Some of you were here, perhaps. It was a wonderful talk. It was Mary Wilson who was telling us about climate change and the impact it has on pandemics. This time, completely new topic, and we will be looking at a topic which a lot has been said about as a solution for abundant energy in full safety, but also clean energy, and this is hydrogen. So we thought we would explore this a little more, and we have Anne Guéraud here with us, who will explain why hydrogen is such a hot topic. So we wanted to see where we stand. Is it a real solution? Is it a myth? Is it only a solution in some areas and not others? Obviously, this is of the utmost interest to Veolia, and Anne will tell us why in a minute. And we have invited Alexandre Joly, who is head of Carbone 4, which was founded by Alain Grandjean and Moscovici, and specializes in energy and climate, especially for companies, for enterprises. Alexandre is an engineer by training. He's a graduate from Centrale Supélec, and he's in charge of the energy division at Carbone 4 and strategy, advocacy, and in charge of popularizing science. He's a specialist of the energy transition. He teaches in several higher learning institutions, Hedge Business School, Sator, GEMA, and many others. He's also the co-founder of a company called Éclairci, and this is a collective of experts working with NGOs on these topics. It's very original. It's very important, given the difficulty to understand scientific matters of this type, which are important for the ecological transition. So hydrogen has no secrets for Alexandre Joly, who will be interviewed by Philippe Maillard, who will also be presenting Anne Guéraud, to whom I now give the floor. Thank you, Dina. You perfectly summed up the reasons why we're here. On behalf of the Scientific and Technological Expertise at Veolia, I am delighted to open this session here with you. So it's our fourth edition of our scientific talks, organized by the Veolia Institute alongside DEST. As Dina just said, we've decided to devote today's session to a strategic matter, which is hydrogen, and to demystify the debate. There are a lot of concrete questions which still haven't been answered. How to produce hydrogen locally and cleanly, what's the cost, what's the impact locally, and what should we think of it today, given that a lot of actors are pulling out of hydrogen projects. So we will attempt to answer all of these questions through our exchanges to follow. For DEST, these questions are at the heart of our work within the X2Fuel project, steered by Philippe Maillard, our R&D expert for energy and low carbon energy. We will be exploring different ways to recover biogas to turn it into hydrogen as well as ethanol. We will be looking at the conversion of solid waste, plastic waste, biomass, and everything that can become new fuel, new types of fuel. And these are concrete leads that we're looking for waste recovery at local level and to contribute to decarbonating local environments, as we've done recently through the Ascent project in Hong Kong, for example. So the spirit of these meetings is to have a dialogue with science between scientists and lay people and to look deeper into certain matters. So I now have the pleasure of introducing Philippe Maillard, who works in the industry and energy and waste treatment for the past 25 years. Thank you, Philippe, for joining me here on the stage. And since 2019, Philippe has been in charge of several R&D projects for the production of green hydrogen from biogas and X. So the recovery of CO2, experimenting with low carbon neighborhoods, and Philippe will be discussing with Mr. Joly, so the author of Perspectives between Limits and Upcoming Challenges. And I now give the floor to Philippe and Mr. Joly. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Anne, for this introduction. Thank you, Dinah. And thank you, Alexandre, for being here with us and to do us the honor of shedding some light on hydrogen with your expertise, because there are a lot of questions around it. So first question, what do people mean when they talk about hydrogen? What does this mean concretely? Well, let's begin at the beginning. Hydrogen is an atom. I'm sure you're all aware of this. It's the smallest, actually, in the periodic table. But it's actually hydrogen 2. So 2 atoms of hydrogen. So I'm not sure if I should be looking at you or looking at the public. Okay, I'll look at the public. So people talk a lot about the energy density of hydrogen. And there are 2 atoms, and if you break the bond between the 2, that creates a lot of energy. But you also have to have energy to produce that molecule, and it's very small. So it disperses, so you have to put it in a reservoir to be able to use it. Otherwise it evaporates. So this poses a practical issue to its use. And what... Today, how is hydrogen produced and for what uses? Currently, usually people take CH4, a natural gas, and the hydrogen is extracted. By doing this, this generates a lot of CO2, like with all fossil energies. So it is a fossil basis. But then for uses, well, there are a lot of possible uses. In industry, for example, refineries used hydrogen to remove sulfur because sulfur leads to health issues, and also to break down carbonated molecules. So there's a whole chain in refineries that then leads to the creation of gasoline. And another use is fertilizer through ammoniac, NH3. So N is nitrogen, and H, well, is hydrogen. So with the Industrial Revolution, well, this led to the creation of fertilizers, and which has made it possible to feed a lot more people. It also creates methanol. So this is CH3OH, which is an alcohol, and CH3 is carbon. And so this is for chemistry. It's the basic building blocks. There are other uses. We won't go over them all, but it can also produce heat, very high temperatures, thanks to hydrogen. So within Veolia, we're very careful as far as safety is concerned. And as Dinah said, we will begin producing hydrogen, and what safety measures do we need to take? This is something that comes back often. A lot of people are afraid that hydrogen is quite dangerous, which is true. Because it's so small, it goes everywhere, and then it can accumulate at the level of the roof, for example, and it's highly flammable, so if it should encounter oxygen, it can catch fire. But it's pretty much the same as any natural gas or petrol. You can have explosions with natural gas at home, unfortunately, and I'm sure you've seen action films where cars explode, and that's gasoline. And it's because there is energy there that it's dangerous. But that doesn't mean that we should all be hiding under a table. So it's massively used in industry today, and there haven't been any major incidents. You just have to have the safety measures in place. You have to have sensors. You need ventilation. So far, no major problems. What we talked about last time was this question of, well, usage. Well, industry's far away, but there are taxis, for example, in Paris that use hydrogen. The company's called Hype. There are buses in Po, where our former Prime Minister has gone back to. So with enough means, yes, you can use it to drive engines. So we know how to keep the risks under control. And now, for decarbonization, what can hydrogen do for us? So low carbon hydrogen for industry and for transport? Yes, that's why a lot has been said about hydrogen. To try to create low carbon hydrogen. So why do we want to decarbonize it? Well, to fight against climate change. This is something that may seem very far away to some, but there are topics which are coming more and more pressing. For example, energy sovereignty. The war in Ukraine has reminded us all that sovereignty is very important. And there's also the question of independence and then health, public health. There are a lot of particles being released into the air. And the particulate matter is at the origin of 40,000 unnecessary deaths every year in France. So maybe I went a little too far. So electrolysis and then hydrogen can be produced from biomass? Yes, indeed. The main source, as Philippe said, is using electricity in an electrolyzer. So you send in water, so H2O. And the electricity separates the two. So you get hydrogen, which is isolated. And this is the easiest way. It simply requires electricity. But there's also hydrogen produced from biomass. Biomass is also quite vague, as you know very well. It could be wood, it can be biomethane, it can be any vegetable material. All of this is biomass. Okay. And does this represent an economic interest for transport, for example? So what does it mean in economic terms? Well, one of the reasons why hydrogen has not progressed more is because it's expensive. It's about 1 or 2 euros per kilo for hydrogen from fossil fuels. And then about 2 and it's 3 or 4 times more expensive to produce it from non-carbon fuels. And even though it's expensive, if it's a way of reducing carbon in the atmosphere, it can be worth it. So cars, for example. Let's take an electric car. I don't know if you know how much mileage it can get, a motor. About 70, so 80% for an electric engine, and about 25% for a thermal motor. So in terms of return, it's extremely efficient. So coming back to my car, okay, I have my electricity. There's some losses with the battery, but pretty much I'm able to retain all electricity. So 100 in electricity, and I need 90% to be available for the vehicle to move. And then with hydrogen, we have some images here. So what you have here, so on the left, electric cars. So 85% yield. The electricity coming into the car and then what comes out in terms of energy. It's not at all the same for a hydrogen car. So we start the same stage, electricity. Then you have to produce the hydrogen, so that's the electrolysis, and it goes up a little bit. And all of this can be improved quite a lot. And then you have hydrogen, which you have to transport and manipulate. For example, if you want to fill up your car, if it were produced at a gas station. And there, where it's very difficult, is batteries. So this is just before the electric motor. The hydrogen has to be, the hydrogen isn't burnt directly by the motor. It goes into a battery. So you lose about 40 or 50% of your energy. And then coming back to the previous phase for electric cars. So the electricity is transformed into hydrogen, and then it's turned back into electricity. So the yield is 35%. So it's about 3 times less effective than the electric alternative. And then it's 3 times more expensive than gas. That's why electric cars, light cars, hydrogen won't be a future for these cars. You can talk about autonomy, you can talk about niche uses, but for most people, we will have electric vehicles with batteries. There's also the question of infrastructure. Right now, you can charge batteries all over, but with hydrogen, that's still a problem. Okay, that's all very clear. So for light vehicles, and what about for heavier vehicles? And then what are some of the other uses of low carbon hydrogen? What should it be used for? Well, there are many things it can be used for. And we'll have to look at all energy uses to see if there are alternatives or not, if it's competitive or not with low carbon solutions. So you have to look at where it would be most relevant. There is the question of mobility. For heavier trucks, for example, I started these analyses in 2018, and it was an open battle between batteries, between hydrogen, and hydrogen is clearly losing. Because in China's experience, scaling up is something you can do with batteries. Batteries now cost very little. Their performance has improved considerably. And when you talk about the sector of heavy trucks, there's actually enough autonomy with batteries for quite long hauls. So a driver can go 500, 600 kilometers, have a break, they can recharge their battery with rapid charging stations, and this is probably where we're headed.
So for these vehicles, heavy trucks at least, clearly, to simplify it, there are other, it's better for heavy vehicles than light vehicles, and then there are even heavier vehicles such as ships. So the question of hydrogen made from biomass that could be used with X-fuels and E-fuels. So here we're looking at mobility. With regard to ships, potentially they could use hydrogen, but it would be fairly expensive. For planes, it's the same problem. We're currently developing sustainable aviation fuels, SAF, using biomass from fields and so forth. And there are e-fuels also that are being studied for planes. But we can see that there is a market for SAF, but what about the development of hydrogen fuels? Well, it could be in the future. And then for industry, there are lots of uses in industry. Here you can see where it is currently being used. As I said, refineries, the production of fertilizers. You need hydrogen for, in some cases, it's necessary as a raw material. Then, of course, there's the question of the future of refineries in today's world. And then there are new uses around the bend. We talk about reducing metallurgic greenhouse gases. So once again, using hydrogen would cost more, but it would be cleaner. And so there's a lot of experiments going on in that field. And future uses? You talked about some of the future uses, but we've talked about electricity clearly is the cheapest source of energy, but you can't store it easily. Well, yes, there are two uses in the energy networks. One that is in the gas network with methane. You can substitute 6% of fossil fuels with hydrogen. It could be interesting, but it's not going to change the world. And then there's the question of storage in the electrical grid. So accompanied with wind power and solar power, the more storage capacity we have, the more we'll be able to use hydrogen. So hydrogen is very useful and renewable. In France, this is a subject that we're still debating. And I think now it's your turn to ask me a question. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I think the question is, what are you doing at Veolia? Yes, indeed. Well, at Veolia, we have an initial unit for producing hydrogen in Hong Kong, but we're also working on water purification. We're in the Normandy project, which is a project at Port-Jérôme in Normandy. And indeed, we're looking at the uses of hydrogen in refinery. We have the largest electrolyzer in Europe, 200 megawatts. And we purify water. So we do have a whole range of procedures. And then in terms of production, we're more at the development stage. We are looking at the biogas. We produce a lot of that, and we're looking at liquefaction of that. We're working at a waste treatment plant in Toulon to experiment with liquefaction. And next year in Hong Kong, we will have a unit that will be in operation. And we're doing it there because the R&D pilot was there in Hong Kong. The director brought the project there with him when he moved there. And in France, we're also beginning to work on this, and we are able to come up with costs that are 2 times less than electrolysis production. So we're looking at costs that are 2 times lower. The environment is constantly evolving, and we're trying to see how we can sell this energy. They're not very big stations, but we could perhaps supply service stations or small fleets of vehicles. You have to compress hydrogen, you have to transport it. This is, of course, very complex, and usually it's best if you can use it within a 50-mile range of where it's produced, because it's very complicated to transport it. And then finally, with regard to truck transport, we're looking at a hydrogen-fueled garbage truck or rubbish collection truck. This is a French startup in Brittany that's been working on this. They're producing the hydrogen locally and using it locally with subsidies, because at this time we still need subsidies before we will be able to achieve the type of maturity that the Chinese have with regard to their battery production, for example. So that's what Veolia is up to. And The next question, and this question is for you. We've seen that there have been huge €1 billion hydrogen projects that have been proposed. And we've seen that a lot of them have dropped off the map. McPhee went into bankruptcy. That was a French company. How can you explain that? How do you interpret it? Well, there's the political instability in France. There's also a problem with planning for energy use in the future. This is a political problem as well, a policy problem. Following COVID, I think people were interested in relaunching this industry with everything that's at stake. A lot of money was brought to the table. So a lot of subsidies went into production of electrolyzers, like McPhee, for example. So they massified the production of these devices that could produce hydrogen from electricity. So the principle is fine, but the problem is there were not enough people to buy the hydrogen that could be produced. It's clear. I mean, if you don't, you can have a beautiful factory, but if you don't have any orders for your products, your factory will fail. So it's really a question of supply and demand. Hydrogen is 3 to 4 times more expensive than other forms of energy. In Europe, we decided to have a system of auctioning for producing hydrogen. The idea was that you could get a subsidy to cover the difference between the cost of producing your hydrogen and what people were willing to pay for it. This went through in 2024, and for stakeholders, we can see that the industrial impact won't be until next year. So you can see that it takes several years and just to create a favorable economic framework for the purchase of low-carbon hydrogen. In France, we had a similar system that was voted in or designed in 2021, and it still hasn't been implemented. Once again, you can see that it takes a long time to find the financing and to implement such a system. For transportation, are there mechanisms that could help low-carbon hydrogen uses in transportation? For example, there could be a reduced price at the service station that's selling it. Would that make the cost of hydrogen-fueled mobility lower? For example, bring it down to the price of regular petrol for your car? Well, you have to have the political will to do so, and you have to make very sophisticated adjustments. Such a framework would have to cover other alternative fuels, not only hydrogen. I think that now for hydrogen, it's not really well suited to that type of use. And also in France, there's a lot of instability. It's an interesting idea. I think it would be worth studying, but I don't think it's really around the corner for us at this point. So, for you, what are the obstacles? What would need to be done in order to make hydrogen a more attractive, more realistic fuel? Do we have to have a better energy planning, more rational planning for our energy consumption in the future? Yes, we need more planning. It's not simple, of course. As I said, there's a planning for production and there's planning for consumption. They don't always meet. You can see that's why McPhee failed. So I think in France, we don't have a good enough knowledge of the industrial landscape. People don't really understand how industry operates on a time scale, for example. this doesn't mean that things that were done in the past were not done well. It just means that sometimes we put the cart before the horse, so to speak, and the industry wasn't ready to adopt these new technologies. So when you talk about metallurgy and steel manufacturing, this is a sector that emits a lot of CO2. And could hydrogen be useful in this sector for reducing emissions? What are the obstacles there? And do you need hydrogen produced by electrolysis, or are there other procedures that could be used? Well, we've looked at some of the different procedures for producing hydrogen. The best way, of course, is through electrolyzers, but biomass is also useful on a local level. But for metallurgy, of course, hydrogen is necessary. It's more expensive. So in France, you've seen there have been deals that have been made between Arcelor and the French government. There's also the question of the whole industrial sector of metallurgy, which is not doing so well in Europe. So this is a decision that's made in a context of a fear of loss of employment and loss of control of the production. In Germany and the Scandinavian countries, they have been carrying out some interesting experiments, however, with the use of hydrogen in this industrial sector. So hydrogen, myth or reality? What are the three key points that you would bring up in this regard? Well, I think you will have understood. The first thing is that it is not necessarily very efficient. So you can only use it in those areas where it can provide an advantage for reasonable use. We have current uses, and there are new uses. It can be for heavy transport. It can be in production of electricity, where there's a lot of variability in the energy resource, which is not the case in France. I think we have some time left for questions. Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. You talked about heavy transport and that hydrogen could be stored in batteries for trucks. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that. I've thought that most batteries were lithium-based, and I wondered if hydrogen could be a way from escaping our dependence on lithium. Yes, it's true. Of course, it's not black and white. Hydrogen does have advantages because it doesn't have to use lithium, as you said, or other rare metals. We were talking about cobalt at one time, but it's true that it's a very tight market for these rare earths. And then there's also the question of the battery industry, which is something that we have not developed much here. Now, once that's been said, I think it depends on what price we're willing to pay to have an alternative hydrogen ecosystem. It would be more expensive in terms of fueling a fleet of trucks, for example. But yes, it's true, it does create other dependencies, but there will never be a world where we're completely independent. In France, so we don't have any of these metals, we don't have that much fossil fuel. So we will necessarily be dependent during the energy transition. So there are two alternatives. One, which is more expensive, hydrogen, to develop the whole ecosystem, the whole energy that we need. And then we would have to import batteries as well. That's 5 or 10% of the total cost. So that means that all of the activity generated by this development, only 5 or 10% of it would be going off to China to pay for batteries. This is energy that could be produced more or less completely in Europe, outside of the batteries. So even though it's more expensive, it would produce economic activity and employment. So it's not such a bad deal after all. Hello, I have a comment and a question. I'll start with the comment. This comparison between an electric motor and a hydrogen motor, I think it's a bit skewed because the electricity in the battery isn't putting out 100%. There's a difference between the electricity produced at a plant and what is stored in the battery. You lose something along the way. And I think on your chart, you should also add the carbon footprint. Because if I have produced electricity from a carbon emitting plant, that increases the footprint. So I think the comparison is a bit defavorable to hydrogen. And then my question concerns the use of hydrogen in a motor, either a fuel cell or through combustion. I think combustion is unrealistic because I can see most of the time we're focusing on fuel cells. So my question is, what are the main disadvantages of a combustion engine for hydrogen? So I would first like to talk about your comment and the comparison that I made between the electric vehicle and the hydrogen vehicle. It's clear that we can see that it's linked to the question of how much energy is lost between the moment of production and its storage. It's much better results with regard to the production of solar and wind energy, in France at least. In France, we have a pretty good mix, including low carbon production of energy, but in other countries it's not the same. A lot of countries are still using natural gas and coal. Now, if you're using gas to produce electricity, to produce hydrogen, to produce a battery, of course, that's a long chain, and there are losses along the way. But I think that overall, the carbon intensity, the carbon footprint is going to be lower nonetheless, especially if you're starting out with biomass. So if you're using electricity from wind power, then you would have a zero carbon footprint. Well, the electrolyzer has to work 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 hours a year, but not always at maximum power. So what we have to do is have a better model for producing hydrogen from a single windmill or even a small windmill field. This would make it more competitive. So that's to answer with regard to the comparisons that I made. I do believe that both of these scenarios could enable us to achieve maximum profitability for hydrogen use in transport.
So why can't we use hydrogen directly in combustion engines? Well, first of all, in terms of efficiency, combustion engines have about 30% efficiency. It can get up to 60% today, so it's twice less expensive to transform it into electricity than to use it directly. And is there not maybe the question of emissions of nitrous oxide? Well, yes, it would have a co-benefits on pollution because you have water coming out of the fuel cells. But it all depends on the quality of the hydrogen, actually. Thank you. I have a question on producing hydrogen. You said that you have electrolyzers, but what about for biomass? I'm not quite sure. Could you explain? And then the second part of my question is, what's the share between electrolyzers and biomass currently? And let's say 20 years from now, where would we like to be? Okay, well, biomass, it's the same principle. There were gas factories a long time ago to pyrolyze coal and to generate gas, CH4. So this generated hydrogen. So up until the 1970s, hydrogen was burned in our gas networks, and that didn't bother anyone. Everybody thought it was normal. But we can use biomass for the same thing with pyrolysis, which is also a way of getting those hydrogen molecules. There is the question of cost and of limits, because on one hand you have electricity. We can't have wind farms everywhere or solar panels everywhere. So hydrogen is in competition, but with a lot of other different things. Yes, we have to eat, we need to fertilize the soil, we need to store energy, feed the soil. So it's hard to... It would be difficult to produce a lot of biomass just to produce electricity, which is why all public subsidies, or most of them, go for low carbon electricity, which is Europe is mostly renewable energy, but also nuclear energy. And I would just like to add that biomass, this is also biogas. And biogas, it can be burned, it can be transformed into biomethane, and can be transformed into hydrogen. So it comes from organic waste. And this might be a simpler way, because this is a way of gasifying biomass. And this is what we will be implementing in Hong Kong. So I have a question. It was in Lorraine, I think. There were sites discovered where there might be natural hydrogen. Is that true? And what are the volumes? And where do we stand with this? And then a second question. In our cleaning networks, we have a lot of H2S. Can something be done with that? So this natural hydrogen, like natural gas, it's better than natural coal or natural petrol. There are places where there are natural hydrogen mines that produce hydrogen year-round, but it's a tiny, tiny amount as compared to what we need. So that will not be enough. That won't meet our needs. And so HES, not sure. We do produce ammoniac. There's a lot of ammoniac in wastewater. We're testing a process which would allow us to transform that ammoniac into hydrogen. So that would be another potential source. So I have two other questions. The first, so you talked about using water vapor, and there's also capture technologies, and then maybe more local use of hydrogen, for example, to replace generators. Well, okay, yes. Carbon capture and storage. The idea would be to have some sort of vacuum around production sites to capture the carbon and then to bury it. There are projects which are being set up, but this requires an entire logistics chain, and there's no value in that currently. There is a European market with quotas, which can give some value, but it would just a few hundred euros per ton of CO2. So right now, there's no financial motivation to do this. There are subsidies. There's some industries are willing to create a market for the future, but It's quite limited, and it would require a lot more public funds. But it's kind of like a magic bullet. So you store the carbon, then you bury it, fine. Seems magic, but we're not going to be able to dig gigantic holes and to store all of the carbon in it. And then what would happen if there were a leak? We don't know what's going to happen in this area. So it's going to take a lot more maturing before we can do anything useful. And also, for hydrogen, everybody wants hydrogen. Industry, metallurgy, etc. So maybe we can do without capturing carbon. And I think we just need low carbon electricity to produce hydrogen. I think for me that's the best solution. Well, on carbon capture and storage, this is indeed a solution to decarbonate hydrogen. There's another solution currently being developed, and this is the pyrolysis of methane. So natural gas, instead of transforming it into hydrogen, but to capture the CO2 and to store it. That's very expensive, but there's an alternative, which is to crack methane molecules into solid carbon and hydrogen. Okay, this cannot be burned because then the CO2 would be released into the atmosphere. But it can be used in construction, for live coal. So this is also being developed. And there was another question? Yes, on the generators. Well, it all depends on the size of the generator. For very major uses, yes, it would make sense. But there are also battery-fueled generators which work very well. So what I mean with these generators, so generally they consume diesel to produce electricity in the case of a power outage. For example, if the lights were to go out in the room, we might have a small generator run by diesel fuel, which would supply electricity. For example, the final of the World Cup. Yes, you might need a generator. The power goes out. In cases like those, if you use biofuel from the fields, this is not something that's used often. So the generators, which are used only as backup, can use biofuels, and the actual cost would be the amortization of the generator itself, because it won't be used very often. So in principle, okay, why not? But we do also have alternative solutions, which allow you to also save costs.
And I would just add that storing petrol is easy, but storing hydrogen is a much more difficult problem. There are different technologies for storage, but I think storing hydrogen is a whole profession in itself. And another question, quite simple. There's no hope for methanization? Methanization, this is producing the hydrogen molecule, and we add methane, so a carbon atom, to create a molecule that is like natural gas, CH4, and you use CO2. Yes, we have hydrogen, we add CO2, and if it's burned off, then the CO2 goes back into the atmosphere. So at the Cerne, they used this system, and then they stored the CO2. They used carbon storage, but it was quite expensive. So the problem is the production of CO2. That's one thing. And then the second thing is it's expensive to produce electricity from hydrogen, and then you have to add CO2. You're losing energy. You end up with CH4. This whole chain of production is quite expensive. The idea is to take a molecule of hydrogen, a molecule of carbon, and produce fuels that are similar to what we use today. Technically, it works. But not only is it more expensive, but it takes a lot of energy to produce. For planes, that's a bit what we're talking about. So I think there would be just only a few instances where that would be useful. And I could add that this works if there are mechanisms for support. That is, there are obligations imposed on maritime and air transportation that require a certain percentage of sustainable fuels. And this is a case where we could imagine a more widespread use of hydrogen. And there are maritime transport companies, CGM, for example, that are looking for low carbon sources of fuel to reduce their greenhouse gas production. It's true there are obligations, but unfortunately they're not widely respected. You know, we're looking at, we're supposed to reduce by 5%, and now we're, I think, optimistically at 1%. So beyond the constraints and obligations, what people are subject to fines. But I think maybe it will just have to be accepted that the costs of hydrogen fuels will be higher, whether it's for aviation or maritime shipping. We talked about fuel cells. Is there still that problem with the catalyzers and pollution? I don't know that much about it, but the idea was that if you're using oxygen from the atmosphere, the catalyzer can be damaged. Yes, we talked about the catalytic converters on certain vehicles that can be damaged. Now, the situation has improved somewhat, but not as quickly as one would like. But it's not that huge a problem. But the rhythm of reduction is that, you know, platinum is a very special metal. We talked about the metals in batteries, but it's no bigger a problem than the problems that we encounter with battery use. Thank you. So we've heard that hydrogen is very expensive and that biomass fuels enter into conflict of use. So what is your vision of the energy of the future? Will it be all electric? And if we use biofuels, can we justify the use of hydrogen for certain uses? And how can we include biofuels in that? Well, it's true. Let's look back at the slide with the different uses. The question of biomass, whether it's from forests or whether it's from fields, it's limited. The forest is already widely exploited, and fields as well are used quite optimally. Then there's the problem of carbon storage. When there's more carbon in the soil, there is more, it works in favor of the production of life, so that can be a positive thing. But when you take biomass out of the ecosystem, that biomass is removed, so you're removing life in a way. So look at wood, for example. Today, wood is used in many different ways. People like to have a fire in their home. Now, if you go out and chop the wood from the field across from your house, that's one thing. But if you have to have it shipped in, then it doesn't have a very good energy balance, in fact, because you could find other systems that would be more eco-friendly. So when you have biofuel produced with wood, you have to see where you direct it to the most relevant use. For example, we could decide not to use wood in housing or in office buildings and use it in industry, for example, instead. This is just a way of illustrating how we have to make our choices. We could get rid of all of the less advantageous uses of wood and only focus on the most advantageous uses, and we would use up less wood than we do now. Now, we've talked about aviation and shipping and the alternative fuels there. Here we have to look at equivalent volumes, in fact, for biofuels that might be better used elsewhere in personal vehicles, for example, or in land-based shipping. So, in fact, there are conflicts of use with regard to biofuel for wood and also for production from the fields. Then there's also wood scraps, which is something that can be used. We make synthetic gas from wood waste, and that can be used also to produce hydrogen. So we look at different waste products like plastic, for example. Maybe we could use them in some other way rather than just burning them up. And these are ideas that are not fully developed, but it's something that we are looking into. And I think I could conclude with when we talk about giving priority to certain uses, we can see that direct electrification is often the best solution, and in those cases we don't need biofuels or hydrogen. Thank you very much. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much. And you're all invited to snap the QR code and fill out the satisfaction questionnaire. Thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you soon.